Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. Morley Square, with its beautiful townhouses and quiet private gardens, was the type of location where scandal was always whispered about, and appearances were kept as tight as the coats worn by its residents in the early fall frost. Mrs. Henrietta Aldmere owned number 7, a large Georgian house with polished brass fixtures and a blood-red front door. Her name is still revered in social columns 10 years after she retired from the theatre. The murder took place on a Thursday evening, just after cocktail hour, as the windows of Morley Square began to flicker with amber light and the distant sounds of a poorly played piano drifted from an open window on the western side. That particular Thursday began with elegance and ceremony, a small dinner party with only 6 people, each known to the others through complicated social connections, and each with an alibi so flawless it could have been rehearsed. Sir Reuben Drake, a wealthy and well-known financier, was the victim, arriving late to the event in a cloud of cologne, scorn, and a cashmere scarf. He was the last to arrive, the first to insult someone, Henrietta's niece's new boyfriend apparently, and by the end of dessert, he had offended at least 3 more people. Sir Reuben never left, however. He was discovered shortly before midnight, slumped in Henrietta's modest study, a glass of port still in his hand, his countenance strangely amused for a guy who had been poisoned. Inspector Crome from Scotland Yard later described it as a calm sort of murder. There was no yelling or struggle. A man sat in a leather armchair, sipped his drink, and died before the fire could even die near him. Mrs. Aldmere discovered the body. She was alleged to have dropped the glass she was holding, but otherwise stayed calm. "Reuben is pretending, surely," she said almost affectionately. "He always did love to be the center of attention." But when he didn't move, when she touched his wrist and felt nothing, she rang the bell and summoned her butler, Mr. Graves, who summoned the doctor, who dispatched the police. In addition to Henrietta and the staff, there were 6 other persons at the house that night. 6 potential suspects, 6 neatly manicured members of polite society with no hair out of place. Everyone insisted that Sir Reuben had poured his own drink, that he had helped himself, as he usually did, with the entitlement of a man who felt the world owed him more than just adulation. Yet someone had ensured that admiration would arrive posthumously. The port had been laced with digitalis, an undetectable amount hidden by the bitterness of the vintage. Nobody had seen anything. Nobody had touched the decanter after Sir Reuben. Nonetheless, the poison came at the exact time it was supposed to. By the next morning, word had spread to select areas of Mayfair. The financier died during a private party at the actress's home. For once, the press was not permitted to gather outside number 7 Morley Square. The square's occupants had collectively employed a security service to preserve privacy, particularly from the types of headlines that lowered property values. Dr. Theophilus Martin, a chubby and quietly fastidious man with spectacles constantly slipping down his nose, placed the call to Mr. Hercule Poirot. He wasn't at the meal, but as Henrietta's long-standing physician and a close friend of Poirot from their occasional chess sessions at the Diogenes Club, he knew when brilliance was required above bureaucracy. "Poirot," he continued over the phone the next morning, "I don't want to speak ill of our friends at the Yard, but I know the inspector in charge, Crome. Very capable, of course. However, this is not applicable to shoe leather and fingerprints. This is a performance. Every guest played a role, and the one who took the final bow is the only one who won't speak. May I ask for your help?" Poirot, already dressed in dove-grey pants and a waistcoat that glittered slightly in the sunlight, twirled the end of his moustache with a thoughtful frown. "Mon ami," he replied, "you talk about a murder in a room full of actors. I believe that the truth will be revealed through gestures, the quiet between phrases. Yes, I'll come." And so it began. By lunchtime, the gloomy London sky hung above Morley Square like a curtain waiting to drop. Poirot's cab rolled up to the curb with the precision of a chess piece finding its proper square. He took a careful step out, as if the sidewalk itself was wrong, then adjusted his gloves cuffs and looked at the row of exquisite residences that framed the garden circle. Number 7 was modestly proud, with a blood-red door and well-polished windows, reflecting the hazy light. Poirot admired the facade's symmetry before ringing the bell. Moments later, the door opened to show Mr. Graves, the butler, tall and skeletal, with a face that appeared carved rather than natural. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," Graves said quietly as he stepped back, "Mrs. Aldmere is expecting you." The interior of the house was calm, too quiet, Poirot concluded. Not a stillness of loss or shock, but the deliberate silence of a place where every thing was aware it was being observed. He let Graves lead him into a lavishly decorated drawing room, where Henrietta Aldmere sat on a high-backed chair that made her appear both majestic and tired. She rose gracefully as Poirot arrived, her silvery hair combed back and secured with a tortoise-shell comb, her gaze fixed. "Monsieur Poirot." "I'm really thankful," he bowed. "Madame, I am grateful to be accepted into your confidence. I hope I may provide clarity where, at present, there is just shadow." She gave a slight smile and nodded toward a chair. "You must find it dreadfully theatrical, a man poisoned in a velvet chair beside a dying fire. Mais non. The theatre is where the truth is expressed aloud behind a mask. That, I believe, is what we should do here as well." She exhaled. "The cops have already taken their statements, of course, but they only see a sealed chamber with poisoned glass. They do not see the rest of it. The things that remain unsaid," Poirot inclined his head. "Then let's speak them. Begin, if possible, with who was present yesterday night." She didn't hesitate. "There were 7 of us, including me and Reuben. I hosted, naturally. My niece Delia Greer was there. She is recently engaged to a young man named Mr. Thomas Vale, who was also invited. Then there was Dr. Conrad Lind, a physician and Reuben's nominal buddy. Ghislaine Arden, a former actress who claims to be retired, also showed up. Finally, Max Hargrove, a dramatist and occasional scoundrel, depending on the season." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A varied cast. They all knew each other in some way, some are lengthier than others. And most have, I now see, a difficult relationship with Reuben. Madame, all history is difficult. However, murder demands more than just difficulty. It requires both intent and opportunity." She folded her hands tightly. "He might be brutal, Monsieur Poirot. He did not spare anyone from his opinions. Delia used to adore him until he took away her allowance and called Thomas a social parasite. Max was once funded by him, but the last play Reuben supported was a disaster, and Reuben was not pleased with it. Dr. Lind has known Reuben for years, but there was a falling out I don't understand. Ghislaine and Reuben were briefly romantically involved. It did not end well." "And yourself, Madame?" Henrietta offered a dry smile. "Reuben and I made a type of agreement. He wouldn't reveal my age if I didn't remind him of his soul." Poirot stood slowly, studying the room. "I'd like to speak with each of them separately. Perhaps in your study." She flinched nearly imperceptibly. "Yes." "If you must." Poirot noticed the movement but did not comment on it. Graves was summoned and dispatched to call each guest back to the house under the premise of assisting Poirot in understanding the late Sir Reuben's last hours more intimately. As the guests arrived one by one, Poirot settled into the room where Reuben had died, an attractive wood-panelled study with deep bookcases, a ticking clock on the mantel, and a pair of chairs near the hearth. The velvet armchair in which Reuben died remained in place, but the port glass had been removed. Poirot didn't sit in it. Delia Greer was the first to arrive. She was a gorgeous young woman with worried eyes and an air of someone striving to stand straighter than her grief allowed. "I still can't believe he's gone," she said softly, folding her gloved hands in her lap. "Reuben was always so present. He made each room feel smaller." Poirot studied her. "And yet you were engaged to a man he disapproved of." "He did not disapprove. He loathed Thomas. They referred to him as a fortune hunter. Threatened to cut me off completely, but he couldn't, legally. I am trusting. Nevertheless, he made things difficult. Always needling. I'm always watching. Was he watching last night? She blinked. Yes, I believe so. During supper, he muttered something hurtful about Thomas's father. I forget exactly what. Then, after dessert, he got up to get a drink, said he wanted a serious chat and went to study. You did not follow? No. I was with Ghislaine. We were gossiping about Max. Then when was the last time you saw Sir Reuben alive? She paused. I believe he stood up after dessert. That was the last time I looked directly at him. Poirot nodded. And Delia was politely excused. He requested her not to leave and to wait in the drawing room. Next came Thomas Vale, a young man with charisma flowing from every pore and a somewhat amused tone of voice. Terrible business, he remarked, shaking his head. I told Delia it was madness to have him here. The man was a viper. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet, you endured his insults with good cheer. Thomas shrugged. Them's how you win over men. Like them. Smile, flatter, and remain standing when they try to knock you down. Did you speak with him alone last night? For a time, yeah, shortly before dinner. He said he had a proposal for me, a business deal. I declined. May I ask why? Because I don't strike bargains with men who despise me. I told him as much. Poirot's eyes glittered. And did he take offense? Thomas gave a gloomy smile. Of course. Reuben always preferred to be the first to go away. Poirot let him go and turned to see Dr. Lind enter. Lind, a lean, dry guy with restless hands, gave Poirot a dubious nod. I've already spoken to the police, the man added. Twice. Ah, but they do not ask what I ask. Lind exhaled. Reuben and I have a past, yes. He supported a medical paper of mine few years ago. However, when it acquired prominence, he attempted to manipulate the findings, putting them into commercial use before they were safe. I refused. He cut ties, publicly. And last night? He ignored me, barely spoke. I left. The table early? Poirot questioned Lind more carefully, observing her repeated gaze at the empty chair. By the time Ghislaine Arden arrived, Poirot had created a map in his mind, fuzzy, but with forms developing. Ghislaine entered the room wearing a dove-grey shawl, her perfume clinging to the books. Oh, mon cher Poirot, she groaned. I suppose you want to know if I killed him. Poirot grinned thinly. It is always a useful place to begin. She gave a quiet, melodious laugh. I didn't. Not this time. Reuben and I were finished long ago. I sobbed really hard once. But after that, he got dull. Did he speak to you last night? Just to check if I still had the jewelry he gave me. I told him I had sold it. I didn't, but I wanted to see the flare of wrath. Poirot did not miss the glimmer of mischief beneath her painted eyes. And was he angry? Furious. But he did a good job of hiding it. As did I. Finally, Max Hargrove arrived, unkempt and without an overcoat, his eyes bloodshot from grief or gin. Reuben was a swine, he stated without prodding, and I don't mourn swine. Poirot let him scream for a full minute before interrupting with a single question. Did you go into the study? Max appeared startled. What? No. Why should I? But Poirot was keeping an eye on his hands, which were shaking slightly due to restraint rather than nervousness. As the door closed behind the last visitor, Poirot stood, alone in the study, gazing at the velvet chair. 6 persons, 6 stories. There is not a single consistent element about Sir Reuben Drake's final 15 minutes of life. He thought that was precisely right. The performance was in motion, and now he would observe the stage from the wings. Poirot remained in the study, for a while after the last guest had left. The fire had long since burned down to pale ash, yet the fragrance of ancient port and cigars lingered on the velvet curtains. He remarked that it was a space made for display. Beautiful mahogany, curated, disarray and perfectly placed books with unbroken spines. A man like Reuben Drake would undoubtedly have liked the illusion of fostered chaos, something to make guests believe he was too intelligent for order. Murder, however, manifested itself precisely in this order. Poirot straightened the fold in his cuff and returned his attention to the mantel. The decanter had been removed, certainly, but its location had been documented in a photograph taken the night of the tragedy. Poirot had already examined it, an object laying at a little inclination, within Reuben's arm's reach but closer to the second chair than the one in which he died. Interesting. Everything in the room may be explained in two ways, by coincidence or choreography. As he proceeded to the side table where the port glasses had been placed out, he observed something little but notable, a faint ring on the lacquered surface where a glass had formerly rested, slightly offset from the others. It was the only one without a twin. Poirot bent slightly and examined it with squinted eyes before reaching into his pocket for a small measuring tape. There is a 2mm variance from the other's alignment. Ah, he muttered. One guest. Stood out, perhaps. Or one guest repositioned a fact. Graves approached silently, as if summoned by Poirot's thoughts. The visitors have left, sir. Should I prepare tea in the drawing-room? Poirot turned. Just a moment. Tell me, were you in the study at any time throughout the dinner? The butler tensed only slightly. Only beforehand, sir, to arrange the decanter and glasses as directed by Mr. Drake. Only Mr. Drake? Yes, sir. He preferred to handle his own drinks and instructed the household not to disturb him unless summoned. Did he seem himself? Graves halted. If I may say so, sir, he appeared very pleased with himself that evening, not jovial, smug. Poirot inclined his head. Merci. And was the decanter fresh? Sir, the bottle is brand new. Only opened an hour before dinner. I brought it in from the cellar. Poirot nodded once more and excused the man. When the door closed behind him, Poirot sat down in the opposite armchair from where Reuben had died. He let the silence settle. About him. A man sat alone in a room. He pours his own beverage. He dies calmly. This, Poirot believed, was more than just murder. It was performance. The poison was timed and measured. More importantly, it was presented in a way that prevented confusion and struggle. He rose and returned to the drawing-room, where Henrietta Aldmere sat with a fresh pot of tea untouched. She looked up as he arrived. You've spoken to them all? I have, madame. Each offered a version of the truth, i.e., a performance. Her lips stiffened. You think they're lying? I think, he responded kindly, that they are all aware that truth is rarely simple when the dead man in question was so skilled at inspiring resentment. She stared at her cup. I wanted the evening to be civil, controlled. A soft gathering. But the softest gatherings, madame, are often the sharpest weapons. She said nothing about it. Poirot sat and accepted the tea she had poured. I noticed, he said cautiously, how you reacted when I asked to conduct interviews for the study. She gazed up at him, direct and unwavering. Because I didn't want to go back in there. Not again. That room is full of him. He smells, his ego. He was always more alive within than anywhere else. Poirot studied her closely. And yet you did not like him. No, she replied. I loved him once. But I did not like him. And that is more dangerous, he said, than either love or hate alone. She looked away. Before he could finish speaking, the doorbell rang. Graves appeared a bit later, wearing a slight grimace. Sir Inspector Crome. He insisted. Poirot tilted his head. By all means. Crome approached with his customary economy, clean, lean, eyes that never smiled. He looked at Poirot. I heard you were meddling, he replied dryly. Dr. Martin thinks the case requires finesse. Poirot smiled. And you disagree? I believe it demands patience. The toxicological report arrived this morning. Digitalis, as expected, concentrated. Someone slipped it into the glass while Drake wasn't looking. But he poured the drink himself. Crome lifted his eyebrow. So, says everyone. But unless the bottle was tampered with, and it wasn't, it had to be the glass. Unless, Poirot replied gently. He drank something he believed he'd poured himself, but which had already been prepared. Crome's eyes narrowed. You think it was planted? I think, Poirot admitted, that a man who prides himself on control would not notice a deception if it mirrored his routine exactly. Crome folded his arms. You think someone predicted he'd help himself? I think someone counted on it. There was a prolonged hush. Then Crome added, You have your notions, Poirot. But so far, we've got 6 people with dubious motivations and 1 dead man who made enemies for sport. However, Only one individual put a poisoned glass with precision. Someone who knew him better than he realized. Poirot stood. "Allow me a couple more hours, Inspector. I'd like to revisit each suspect, not with questioning but in silence. Observe what they reveal when nothing is said." Crome gave a brief nod. "Very good, but don't drag this out for too long." Poirot watched him leave. Then he turned to Graves. "Could you please encourage Miss Arden to return? Assume that I have recovered something of hers. Nothing more." As Graves left, Poirot returned to the study. This time he set a single empty port glass on the table and waited. When Ghislaine Arden entered around 20 minutes later, she appeared perplexed. "Something of mine, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot motioned to the glass. "Madame, this is a memory. Drake, do you recognize this?" She stared at it for a moment before laughing softly. "It might be any one of them. They all look the same." Poirot said nothing. He didn't move. The stillness moved on like fog. She shifted slightly. "Why call me here for this?" Nonetheless, he did not speak. Her fingers began to fiddle with the hem of her sleeve. "I was never alone with my spectacles. Reuben was the only one who poured." Poirot finally met her gaze. However, someone else had already prepared one. It was waiting, wasn't it? Her mouth twitched. "If you already know that, why ask me?" "I'm asking because you were the last one to leave the room before Reuben arrived. You passed the study, and a glass already filled was separated from the others." She straightened up, outraged. "You think I killed him?" "I believe you anticipated him. You knew how he would act. You knew he'd choose the glass that stood alone, the one closest to his chosen chair. He always sat there, just so." She drew a short breath and glanced aside. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He'd seen the flicker, not guilt, but something else. A moment of reckoning, then it went, and Ghislaine gave a tiny smile. "Perhaps you are too clever, Monsieur Poirot." "Or perhaps," he responded, "I have not yet asked the right question." She said nothing, yet her quiet rang louder than any complaint. Poirot let her go. He stood by the glass staring at it, not for a response, but for the reflection it may still provide. The study door closed behind Ghislaine with a quiet click of a well-oiled latch, leaving Poirot alone once more in the late financier's castle. The port glass remained untouched, indicating intention more than thirst. Poirot stood beside it, motionless, absorbed in the architecture of the moment, its proportions, contradictions, one glass out of place. One of the guests seemed overly prepared, and a murder that seemed to blend into symmetry. He remained motionless until Graves emerged stealthily in the doorway. "If I may, sir, Mr. Max Hargrove has returned unexpectedly. He insists he left his scarf behind." "I found none, but—" "He seems persistent." "Show him in, Graves," Poirot instructed without hesitation. Max came with a burst of furious energy, his hair wind-blown and his coat collar raised as if he had been pacing in the square rather than waiting for an excuse. His gaze darted about the study, and Poirot noticed the flare of strain beneath the surface. "You've found it, right?" "The scarf?" Max asked too nonchalantly. "There is no scarf," Poirot responded softly. "Only your conscience, monsieur, which you are clearly trying to recover." Max abruptly paused. "I beg your pardon." Poirot motioned toward the velvet chair. "You disliked Sir Reuben, that much is obvious to everyone. However, hatred alone will not poison a glass. No, for such one requires opportunity and, more crucially, confidence." Max narrowed his gaze. "Are you accusing me?" "I am watching you," Poirot said simply, "and wondering why you truly came back." Max opened his mouth and then seemed to reconsider what he was about to say. He averted his gaze and placed his hands in his pockets. Poirot stepped forwards. "Tell me, when did you last see Reuben alive?" Max exhaled slowly. "After dessert." He jumped up and muttered something, perhaps a barb at someone. I was not paying attention. I went into the hallway to smoke. And then I stayed there. Only a minute or two. Delia came out next. "Did you see her enter the study?" "No." His brow wrinkled. "But I think I heard the door close." Poirot nodded, storing the information. "And yet you did not check?" Max's voice became brittle. "This wasn't my house. I assumed he had gone in alone." "Convenient," Poirot mumbled. "And yet, perhaps not untrue." Max crossed his arms. "You think I killed him over a failed play?" "I believe, monsieur, that your pride is a sensitive thing, and Sir Reuben was not known for treating fragile artifacts with care." Max's jaw clenched. "He laughed at me, said I'd squandered his money. They called me a leech in front of everyone." "So you followed him?" "No." A pause. "I wanted to. But I didn't." Poirot studied him silently. "I know what this looks like," Max said more calmly. "But I did not poison him. I swear." Poirot gave no indication of belief or doubt. "Thank you, monsieur. That's all for now." Max paused, then turned and departed, his steps trailing against the wood floor. When the door shut, Poirot looked down again at the port glass. Something did not fit. Yes, there is choreography, but not a cast. He moved to the small escritoire at the far window, its drawers neatly closed, and opened the bottom one. Back. Issues of the Financial Herald were inside, dog-eared and with Reuben's bold handwriting on them. Notes on mergers, allegations of incompetence, and predictions of failure. There, on the third page of one edition, was Max Hargrove's name, underlined. 3 times in green ink. "Artless and incoherent," Poirot stated aloud, the sort of review that never forgets. There was a faint knock on the door. Graves again. "Sir, Miss Greer has asked to talk with you. She says she remembered something." Poirot arose instantly. "Of course. Show her within." Delia approached with the demeanor of someone battling indecision. Her coat was slung over her shoulders, and she made no attempt to remove it. She held her handbag securely. "I'm sorry," she said at once. "I was not going to say anything. It's probably nothing." "Then it is certainly something," Poirot said kindly, motioning for her to sit. She sat on the edge of the velvet chair, avoiding the other. "I remembered. When Reuben got up from the table, I didn't see where he went. But I noticed Thomas get up a minute later. He stated he was going to the bathroom, but I do not know. He appeared odd, as if he were preparing for a performance." Poirot nodded. "And you did not think this strange at the time?" "I was too angry," she said. "Reuben had embarrassed me again over dinner. He mentioned my trust fund, and who actually managed it. It was cruel. Did Thomas hear?" "He pretended not to." "But yes, he heard." Poirot sat back and watched her closely. "And yet you said nothing to the police." "I didn't want to hurt him." "Even now?" Delia paused, her eyes moist. "I don't know what I want." Poirot's voice softened. "You want the truth, mademoiselle. That's the first step toward justice." She gave a tiny nod before rising. "I'll wait outside." Poirot let her go, but as soon as the door closed, he went for his notebook and wrote down a single line. "Thomas went after Reuben. They said it was the lavatory." Delia is unsure. Poirot tapped his pencil across the edge of the paper. He remembered Thomas's comfortable demeanor as he spoke of Reuben's business idea. "I told him no," he had stated. But what if he had replied yes? Or worse, what if Reuben had said yes to him? Poirot rose hastily and called for Graves. "Would you?" "Be so kind," he said, "as to bring Mr. Vale to the study at once." Graves left and Thomas came minutes after. He appeared serene, but Poirot noticed the minute tightness in his smile and the way his shoulders rolled softly, as if discharging an invisible weight. "You wanted to speak with me again?" he inquired. Poirot folded his hands. "Indeed, I should. Clarify something. Was Sir Reuben's proposal to you a genuine opportunity or a trap?" Thomas blinked. What do you mean?" "I mean, did he offer you something you truly wanted, or did he bait you with it in order to humiliate you?" Thomas exhaled, but it wasn't quite a chuckle. "That sounds like him, doesn't it?" But what happened? Thomas's eyes hardened slightly. "He offered to invest in the company I'd been pursuing, a significant amount. Naturally, I was suspicious, but when I inquired why, he explained that it was to restore Delia's favor." "And you believed him?" "No," Thomas acknowledged. "I didn't, but I wanted to. I wished her peace, to have security. If accepting Reuben's money was the price, I was willing." Poirot leaned forwards. And what changed? Thomas was silent for a moment. He said he would draw up papers in the morning. That night he toasted me, just before dessert, quietly. Nobody noticed. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Thomas's voice dropped. I didn't poison him. I did not say you did, but you think I had cause. Poirot rose and cautiously proceeded to the sideboard. I believe, monsieur, that Sir Reuben enjoyed playing puppeteer, but he forgot puppets have strings, and strings can snap. Thomas was silent. Poirot turned around to face him. Did you enter the study before he died? Thomas's gaze met his. Yes. Poirot nodded once and said nothing more. He let the stillness continue until Thomas softly excused himself. Poirot was alone again, staring into the hearth of the study. The performance had gone exactly as Reuben had intended. He controlled the space, the people, the order of events. However, someone else had modified the final act. The truth was, somewhere in that choreography, between the glasses, glances, and gestures, Poirot stayed in the room after Thomas Vale had left, his fingertips softly squeezed together beneath his chin, and the tips of his shoes neatly aligned beneath his chair. The silence in the room had become deep, as if the air itself remembered the weight of Reuben Drake's last breath. As the evening approached, the investigation's cadence tightened, a silent pressure growing just beneath the surface. Someone among them was beginning to fracture, ever so slightly, and Poirot, always the observer of detail and imbalance, could feel the first hairline crack. He returned to the port glass, which was still perched precisely where he had left it, now illuminated by the mellow warmth of the setting sun slipping through the parted draperies. The poisoned drink was not a spontaneous act. It had been well planned, positioned, timed, and concealed beneath ritual and routine. That was the brilliance of it. Whomever did this had relied on Reuben's own predictability. Not a conflict. Not even a trick. A mirror held up just long enough for him to overlook the defect, and now Poirot had to figure out who had held that mirror. He was about to summon Dr. Lind for a second conversation when a soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Graves entered again, this time holding an envelope. It was just delivered, sir, a courier. There's no return address. Marked for your attention. Poirot accepted it with a little nod and flipped it over. The paper was of excellent quality, thick and textured. The calligraphy on the front was unfamiliar to him, bold, exquisite, and little hurried. He shattered the seal. Inside was a single sheet, typed. I know exactly who did it, but I will not be next. Look at the scarf that isn't there. No signature. Poirot looked at the telegram for a long time. Then he reread it slowly. A fake scarf. A contrived allegation of a lost object. Max Hargrove's purported cause for returning. However, Poirot had observed at the time how conveniently that justification had emerged, and how swiftly it had frayed when tested. Someone else had noticed too. But who? He stood up and called for Graves. I need the complete list of household staff and their movements on the evening of Sir Reuben's death. This includes the kitchen staff, servants, and anyone else that is present. You will also make arrangements for them to remain in the house tomorrow morning for further interrogation. Graves was slightly whiter than usual and bent. At once, sir. Poirot returned to the hearth and peered again into the embers of the now cold fire. I know who did it. A daring claim. But was this true, or is it only bait? He was still thinking about it when a soft footfall alerted him to another presence. Henrietta Aldmere stood in the doorway, one hand lightly resting against the frame. She appeared tireder than she had earlier, more human, less poised. The edges of her function as hostess were fraying. You've spoken to them all now, she remarked, stepping in. Poirot turned. Yes, I have, and you, madame, have been quite generous in letting me use your home. She waved the compliment away. This is not generosity. I want the truth. Poirot studied. Her. May I ask you something personal, madame? Her eyebrows lifted, but she nodded. Did Reuben ever write a new will? She paused. Not that I know of. His solicitor may know more. But you suspect something changed. She sighed and stepped to the mantel, resting her palm on it. Yes. He had suddenly grown more sentimental. He mentioned leaving everything right to Delia. I assumed he meant her trust, but he was ambiguous. Poirot didn't say anything for a bit. At that point, would anyone benefit unexpectedly if Reuben died before amending his will? She let forth a quiet, bitter laugh. Almost everyone is here. Reuben lived on hanging promises. But certainly if he died before any modifications were made, the last legal will would stand. Delia, of course, is the primary benefit, and Thomas if they get married. Ghislaine was named years ago. I'm not sure if it still exists. Max was written in for a sum. Even Dr. Lind, I suppose, was included in the days before they split. Ah, Poirot replied gently. So everyone had hope, and Madame Hope is the cruelest thing to weaponize. Henrietta nodded slowly. And yet Reuben did. After she went, Poirot called once more for Graves, who appeared with a sheaf of neatly typed paperwork documenting the staff duties for that evening. The footman had been stationed in the kitchen till almost 10 o'clock. The housekeeper had retired early due to a migraine. Only the scullery maid, a young girl named Elsie, had walked inside the study briefly to retrieve the tray. Reuben had requested to be placed outside. She had not seen him. She had scarcely opened the door. However, Poirot noticed that she had entered. He made a note to talk to her in the morning. Then he returned to his letter. Look at the missing scarf. He pondered the sentence, trying to figure out what it meant. It wasn't just about Max, it was about absence. Something invented. A space that never existed but was deliberately claimed. And if a scarf can be used as a fake pretext, what else may have been created or disguised in the same way? Poirot's eyes narrowed. He crossed the study and studied the bookcase nearest the door. A narrow blue volume sat somewhat out of alignment. The Wisdom of Silence. Poirot pulled it out. Nothing within save its own pages. No hollowed compartment, no letter tucked away. But when he moved it back, his fingertips brushed against something smaller between the books. A folded piece of paper squeezed into the crevice behind the row. He eased it free. It was a ripped corner from an old typed letter. Only the lower section remained, but the lines were clearly Reuben's. All you ever cared about was what I could give you. That's it for now. Consider this the final performance. The curtain falls tonight. Poirot's heartbeat quickened. This was not a business. This was personal. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. Someone had disagreed with Reuben, probably in writing, and attempted to remove the proof, only leaving a portion behind. Someone knew the curtain would fall. Hercule returned to the decanter on the sideboard. So Reuben had poured the drink, but did he choose the glass? Or had one glass already been subtly separated, exactly as he preferred? This is the final performance. Yes, Poirot's gaze lifted to the study's thick door. The murderer did not commit the crime out of passion. They hadn't panicked. They had waited, prepared, and placed a poisoned chalice in the hands of a man who was too egotistical to recognize trickery. But Poirot noticed the contour of it, a symmetry beneath the falsehoods, a gentle realignment of trust, affection, and ego, a drama written by someone who knew Reuben well enough to forecast both his habits and his pride. It wasn't simply about motivation, it was about choreography. He would then put the cast through another test the next day. Morning arrived slowly in Morley Square, with a mist that lingered against the windows like breath held too long. The house at number 7 moved slowly, despite the fact that Poirot had been awake since sunrise, dressed immaculately in a grey suit with the tiniest pinstripe, and a tie knotted with the care of a man prepared not only for the day, but also for a confrontation. There was no need for dramatics because the theatre was already in progress. All that was left was to inspect the stagecraft. In the breakfast room, Henrietta Aldmere poured her coffee without comment, while Poirot looked over the table of cold meats and warmed croissants. The silence between them was companionable, but not idle. She spoke first. I assume your thoughts are beginning to narrow. Poirot made a single nod. Indeed, the threads are becoming fewer. But it's not yet time to tie them. She looked up. Then you suspect who it is? I believe they suspect themselves, he said gently, and that is often the beginning of mistakes. He waited until Graves notified him that the household workers had been gathered, then took his time finishing his breakfast. There was no rush. If pressure is to be exerted, it must be mild and continuous, like twisting a screw. The first person summoned was Elsie, the scullery maid. She was just 16 years old, her hands red from washing and her eyes wide from being asked to speak to someone who had once dined with royalty. She perched on the edge of her chair in the study, her legs crossed tightly at the ankle. "You entered this room the night Sir Reuben died," Poirot stated softly, as if inviting her to discuss the weather. She nodded swiftly. "Just get the tray. Mr. Graves instructed me to. Did you notice the decanter? Or the glasses?" Her brow furrowed as she attempted to recollect. "Sir, those were already on the table. I believe 4 glasses were on the silver tray, but there were 2 more on the small table next to the chair." "2 glasses," Poirot repeated. "Not 1?" "Yes, sir, but one of them appeared empty. The other, it contained something. I did not touch them, I swear." Poirot leaned forwards. "And when you say one looked empty, do you mean you believe someone had already used it?" I do not know. It was a little further away, near the corner. The one with liquid was closer." To the chair, he nodded. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been extremely helpful." She rose, visibly relieved, and virtually departed the room. 2 glasses. One was purposely placed while the other was discarded. Poirot now saw the intention clearly. The alcohol had not only been planted, it had been portrayed as choice. Graves entered again, this time to inform that Dr. Lind had arrived early. Poirot wasn't surprised. The doctor walked in with a rapid, clipped gait and a tiny twitch in his jaw, as if he'd been debating the logic of returning right up until he stepped into the room. "I heard you were interviewing the staff," he stated without explanation. "I am speaking to all witnesses," Poirot said, gesturing toward a chair. "I hoped you might help me clarify something." Lind sat unwillingly. "Go on." "You mentioned before that you and Sir Reuben had a falling out regarding the use of medical data." "That's correct. But you also said he ignored you entirely at dinner." Lind hesitated. "Yes," Poirot tilted his head. "And yet your name appears in his previous will. It seems strange to me, Dr. Lind, that a man who felt deceived by you would leave such a detail intact. He may have forgotten, or he intended to change it." Lind's jaw stiffened. "Is this why you summoned me back here? To entice me with half-suspicions?" Poirot's tone was cool. "No, Doctor. I called you back because someone had placed a poisoned glass in this room, which required knowledge of both timing and physiology. How long digitalis takes to work, how much to dispense, and how to disguise it in a bitter vintage." The resulting silence was similar to a held breath between 2 lines of dialogue. Lind did not respond at once. "I didn't kill him," he admitted, finally. "But you're correct. I understand how it was done." Poirot's expression did not change. "Then who?" "I can't say. Not yet. But I can assure you that it was not spontaneous. It wasn't vengeance. It was elegant." Poirot nodded slowly. "That's the danger of elegance, Doctor. It hides the grotesque." Lind rose. "If you discover what I believe you will, you'll see why no one has spoken. Reuben wasn't simply disliked. He had been used, and the people who used him, some of them, are still playing their roles." Poirot watched him leave. There it was again, the language of performance, as if Reuben Drake in his final moments had been a character created from his own script. The note, the scarf, the false glass. Poirot walked back from the fireplace and pulled a shredded corner of the letter from his pocket, which he had discovered behind the bookshelf. "Consider this a final performance." The phrase repeated like a motif. Someone, possibly the murderer, knew Reuben better than anyone. Understood that he felt himself untouchable, that he would drink from the glass nearest to his chair, not the one that had previously been used, that he would never consider himself a target, especially in his own chamber, surrounded by people he had controlled for years. Graves returned again, this time carrying a silver tray. "A message from Miss Arden," he announced. "She wants to speak with you privately before the others arrive. She is in the library." Poirot nodded, took a final glimpse at the empty glass on the study table, and followed the butler into the adjoining room. Ghislaine Arden stood near the window, wrapped tightly in her shawl, despite the fact that the room was warm. "You've been busy," she stated without turning. Poirot closed the door. "So have you, I imagine." She turned slowly. "I suppose it was only a matter of time before you uncovered the note." "The one behind the bookshelf?" She delivered a dry smile. "Reuben wrote it a week before the dinner. I discovered it while hunting for a book on his bookshelf. He must have discarded it, or planned to destroy it, but never did. You kept it. I was planning to show it to Delia. I wanted her to see the kind of man he truly was. But then I wondered, what if it made matters worse? What if she tried to confront him?" Poirot waited. Ghislaine stepped forward. "He was planning to cut her out. That is what the letter meant. He stopped trusting her. Or Thomas. He believed they were manipulating him. Were they?" She looked away. "I do not know, but they were not saints. Delia desires tranquility, definitely. What about Thomas? Thomas wants a legacy." Poirot's gaze hardened. "And you? What did you want?" "To be free of him," she murmured. "I'm not dead. Just irrelevant." Then, why return to the house after the police had already taken their statements? "I told you," she continued, her voice becoming brittle. "He asked about the necklace. I lied and claimed I sold it. But I did not. I hid it here in the library, in a book I assumed he'd never open. I came back to get it before anyone else noticed." Then Poirot examined her face. "Which book?" she faltered. "The playbook from the House with Two Faces," she finally said. "He despised it. Said it was vulgar." Poirot approached the shelf, reached without reluctance, and drew down the tiny volume. When he opened it, a little velvet packet fell on the carpet. He knelt down, took it up, and opened it. Inside was a jewelry, undoubtedly of high worth, but it wasn't alone. An additional slip of paper was folded behind the purse. Poirot read it once, then twice. His respiration did not change, but his eyes were quite still. He then gazed up at Ghislaine. "Merci, madame," he replied softly. "This is most revealing." And suddenly the game had changed. Poirot returned to the study alone, the small velvet pouch securely fastened to the inner pocket of his waistcoat, its weight minuscule in comparison to the paper folded behind it. The slip had contained only a few lines, typed, not handwritten, but the wording was exact. It was a draft of Reuben Drake and Thomas Vale's confidential agreement, unsigned, but dated 2 days before the dinner. Gathering. Reuben provided a bridge financing for a large investment in exchange for Thomas, postponing his formal engagement to Delia for a year. The delay is ostensibly intended to ensure sound motives and appropriate maturity. That clause alone was damning, not because it proved anything about the crime, but because it indicated Reuben's ongoing need to exert control, even as he provided assistance. And it demonstrated that he saw Delia's attachment and Vale's ambition as potentially opposing forces. Reuben, ever the puppeteer, had once again positioned himself between two people, dictating terms with his trademark charm and ruthlessness. But the document had never reached a lawyer. It had been folded and hidden, much like the necklace. It was hidden away in a place only Ghislaine knew about. He knew she had not killed Reuben, not because of the jewelry or the note, but because her reaction remained same after he read it aloud. Her eyes had become chilly, not terrified. She had concealed evidence, but not from guilt, from bitterness, a different type of motive. The study's shadows changed with the changing light. Poirot sat down again, this time purposefully in the chair, where Reuben had died, facing the small side table. He folded his legs and clasped his fists. Everything was finally in place. The glass, the scarf, the false trail, and the motives. He'd seen enough. It was time to plan the final act. He called for Graves, who arrived as quietly as ever. "Please notify Mrs. Aldmere that I require the presence of all past and present guests in the drawing room within an hour. No exclusions. And Graves, make sure they are seated." "I will speak while standing," Graves bent. "Of course, sir." Poirot stayed sitting for a bit longer, the calm ticking of the mantel clock breaking the silence. He thought about Reuben's letter. Again, the curtain falls tonight. That had not been prophetic, it had been a warning. Not to the murderer, but to Reuben himself. Recognition that someone in that house had the fortitude, or desperation, to write the finale for him. Poirot entered the drawing room 45 minutes later, and it had already been set up just as he had requested. The guests sat in different couches and sofas arranged evenly around the walls. Henrietta stood at the piano, composed yet pale. Crome approached discreetly and leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, calmly observing. Poirot occupied the center of the room. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said quietly but firmly, "you must forgive the interruption. I apologize that your pleasant gathering has turned into a murder scene. But it is so. A man has died. Not through adversity. This was not by chance, but according to plan. Nobody moved." Poirot let the words settle like dust. "You have all spoken to me," he said. "You've shared your recollections, ideas, and evasions, and in so doing you have exposed more than you disguised. That's always the way. The truth is something that clings. Even in silence it leaves fingerprints." Thomas Vale moved slightly in his chair. Poirot noted it but did not pause. The poisoned glass was not poured by someone else. That is the genius of the crime. Sir Reuben chose it consciously and frequently. The murderer did not need to place the drink in his hand. They only needed to prepare the stage for him to select the appropriate one. Delia took a soft breath. Poirot turned to face her. "Miss Greer, you claimed you didn't glance directly at your uncle after dessert, but you also mentioned that you were with Miss Arden. In fact, you weren't." Her cheeks were faintly colored. "I was upset. I needed air." Poirot nodded. "So you stepped into the hallway." "And so did Thomas." Thomas straightened. "I explained it. I was going to the restroom." "Indeed." "Nonetheless, the lavatory is on the far side of the house, but the scullery maid noticed someone enter the study at that time." "Not Reuben." "Before him," Thomas frowned. "That proves nothing." "No?" "Then let me add this. Sir Reuben had reached a financial agreement with you, one that would postpone your engagement. He drafted the document, but did not sign. A copy is presently in my possession." Delia turned abruptly to face Thomas. "What?" Thomas remained frozen, his jaw tight. "He did not tell you, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked kindly. "Ah, then the motivation becomes evident." Thomas discovered his voice. "That means nothing. He made offers all the time." "They meant nothing." Poirot shakes his head. "Non, monsieur. You—" Forget that Reuben was altering his will. He was going to change the balance of power, and if he had lived till dawn, you would have been written off. Unless he never went to the solicitor. There was a prolonged, tense pause. Then Poirot proceeded. "You entered the study not to kill, but to argue. You wanted to amend the agreement, or perhaps revoked, but he refused. And as you departed, you noticed the port glasses, 6 of them. Already one was his usual. The one nearest to his chair. Thomas was now pale. You've seen the bottle. You witnessed the bitter vintage. You knew, given your history and knowledge, that a concentrated drop of digitalis in such a harsh wine would go unnoticed. And the medicine cabinet upstairs?" Poirot glanced at Crome, who nodded grimly. "Empty. Bottles were discarded. I found them just now." "And so," Poirot said softly, "you placed the poisoned glass exactly where Reuben would choose it, believing he poured it himself. You weren't required to see the act. You merely needed trust in his pride. And that, monsieur, you had." Thomas rose abruptly. "You have no proof, no fingerprints, no poison bottle. Nobody saw me do anything." Poirot smiled sadly. "Because that's how you intended it. But there was one thing you didn't plan. A wrong step. You returned the following day, pretending you had forgotten your scarf." Thomas blinked. "What?" Poirot turned. "Not you!" Ghislaine Arden's voice came through softly and clearly. "That was Max." Max Hargrove let out a short, bitter laugh. "I did not kill Reuben, but I did come back. I needed to retrieve a letter. One I wrote, angry and foolish. I never sent it, but I had kept it in my coat pocket. I did not want it found." Poirot gazed around the room. "Do you see? Lies unravel in reverse. Each one offers the framework for the next. Finally, the truth is left standing." Thomas stood motionless. Delia, her face devastated, stared at him as though she no longer recognized him. "I didn't mean to," Thomas admitted at last. "Not really. I doubted it would work. I assumed he'd smell it, he'd know. He always knew everything. Poirot's voice remained silent. And yet he did not. That was the disaster. He trusted the glass because it echoed his expectations. Monsieur, your strike was not motivated by hatred. You hit out of terror, the fear of losing something you never had. Thomas sat down heavily. Delia moved her head away. Crome stepped forward, his expression gloomy. That's enough for me. Poirot offered a slight nod. Then justice may proceed. As Crome went to apprehend Vale, Poirot strolled carefully to the window, his reflection pale in the dimmed glass. Outside, the mist hung in Morley Square, unaffected by the theatre inside. Henrietta approached him, speaking softly. So that's it? He did not turn. Yes. The performance is over. She looked back at the others, then down at her hands. It was never really about the money, was it? No, Poirot answered. It never is. The drawing room slowly emptied, each guest, leaving with a different gait, some light-footed with relief, some rigid with guilt, and one led in silence by Inspector Crome. The door closed behind Thomas Vale with finality, draining the room's last air. Delia had not spoken since her fiancé's confession. She remained seated, her hands curled into themselves like paper wilting at the edges, her gaze fixed on a corner of the carpet with no stain. Poirot didn't bother her. Instead, he proceeded to the sideboard and poured a tiny cup of coffee from the silver carafe Graves had surreptitiously brought in, as if the household had anticipated this conclusion, and with it, a sense of grief. The aroma mixed with the lingering sense of old port and ash, remnants of Reuben Drake, the man who had organized so many lives without ever realizing the subtle implications of his actions. When Delia finally stood up, Poirot turned to her, gently. Mademoiselle, you must excuse my candor in revealing the facts so publicly, but I believe you prefer clarity to comfort. Her voice, when it came, was faint, yet soothing. He adored me, you know. Thomas. He actually did. Poirot tilted his head. I think he did. But love, when combined with desperation, becomes far more destructive than hatred. He was so afraid, she continued. He was afraid of losing his place, his name. Everything he thought made him important. Oui, Poirot replied gently. Reuben understood that terror all too well. He knows how to make a man feel worthless without stating it directly. Delia looked at Poirot, and the shine in her eyes had changed to something more serious. Resolution, perhaps, or the first gleam of self-assurance. What happens to Thomas now? She inquired. That, Poirot explained gently, is in the hands of the law, but I believe the court will find that the deed, while premeditated, was not without anguish. His grief is not feigned. She nodded, but the action seemed to be more about ritual than belief. Will you stay here, mademoiselle? For a while, she replied. Aunt Henrietta has offered me the guest suite. I need quiet. I need to recall who I was before allowing someone else to write my lines. Poirot gave her a tiny, courteous bow. Then, I wish you peace in the finding. She exited the room with the ease of someone going off a stage, not triumphant or broken, but transformed. Later that evening, Poirot returned to the library, the volume of The House with Two Faces neatly placed, back on the shelf. Inspector Crome received the necklace and the unsigned agreement. The paper, while legally useless, served as the emotional key to solving the crime. A powerful man dangles it like bait. A man with ambition sees the bait as a lifeline, and between them, a woman, misused and misled, but never insignificant. Ghislaine Arden entered the room without knocking. She had changed into a more somber grey, with her typical flair muted. Still elegant, but with something pared down. Poirot didn't look up at first. He was looking out the large window, watching fog accumulate around the street lamps, like ghosts. From the evening's drama. You found the villain, she stated, folding her arms. I found the murderer, he clarified softly. The villain, I fear, was more than one. She smiled slightly. What do you think of me now, monsieur? Still clever? Are you still hiding too much? I think, he replied softly, you once loved Reuben. Not lately or even fondly, but in a way that left a scar. I believe you retained the necklace because it reminded you that someone once cared enough to beautify you. And I believe you hid it because you knew the longing had turned ugly. Ghislaine did not refute it. He told me once that I was a beautiful mistake. Mon Dieu, Poirot said quietly. What a terrible compliment. She moved forward, one hand resting on the back of an armchair. Will you report me? For withholding evidence? You've returned the necklace, and here's the note. That was sufficient. She nodded. Good, I'm tired of theatre. Poirot turned to her with piercing yet compassionate eyes. You are still acting, madame. Only now you're the playwright. She genuinely smiled this time and left him alone. Much later, when the house was quiet, and Graves had retired for the night, Poirot returned to the study. The port decanter had been cleaned, and the glasses were stowed. The velvet chair hadn't been touched. He sat in it one final time. The silence in the room was no longer frightening. It was simply still. He gave himself a rare moment of concentration, reclining back, fingertips together, gaze drawn to the flames. Thomas Vale did not poison Reuben out of malice. He had done it because he felt he was being erased, relegated to a background character in someone else's future. Reuben had mastered the skill of destabilizing others while claiming to be helpful. He extended lifelines with one hand while holding scissors in the other. However, it was not his harshness that ultimately killed him. It was his predictability, his assurance that no one would dare to deviate from the positions he assigned them. He had been wrong. Poirot stood up and approached the window once more. Outside, the square remained lit by the orange glow of old lamps and the odd blink of a car's taillight. The world's obstinate indifference continued. Behind him, the clock on the mantel chimed softly. 10 o'clock. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, fixed his lapels, and fetched his hat from the side table. As he opened the door to depart, he hesitated briefly at the threshold and looked back into the room. The performance is over, he announced gently. But the lesson remains. With that, he strolled out into the darkness, bringing the affair at murder at Morley Square to a close. The following morning, London woke beneath a faint sun that appeared almost unwilling to rise. Morley Square was quiet, except for the tweeting of a solitary sparrow on the wrought-iron rail outside number 7. Inside, the silence was no longer heavy with secrets, but with the strange quiet that comes with a house devoid of illusion. The performance, as Poirot had stated, was ended, but the scenery remained. Poirot arose early. He had no further obligations in the case. Inspector Crome had arrested Thomas Vale the night before, and all statements had been filed. But Poirot was not the type to leave a stage without checking the wings one more time. He descended to the breakfast room to find Henrietta Aldmere already sitting, the newspaper folded in her lap, and her coffee cold. She looked up as he entered and offered a faint grin. "There's something brutal about newspapers," she remarked. "They report murder with the same voice they use for fashion and football scores." "Ah," Poirot said, "but that is their aim. They speak without emotion so that others can feel it." She gestured toward the chair across from her. "You've already accomplished what you came for. But I sense you haven't gone yet." Poirot sat. "Madame, there is one unresolved matter." "A little one. However, it is frequently the smallest thread that causes the entire garment to unravel." Henrietta tilted her head. "Go on. I have explained the motive. For this opportunity, for the means." Nonetheless, one detail continues to irritate. He delved inside his inner pocket and produced the anonymous note, which read, "I know exactly who did it, but I will not. Be next. Look at the missing scarf." He slid it along the table. "I believe you recognize it." Henrietta's gaze sank to the paper. She read it again before folding her hands over it without comment. "You wrote it," Poirot remarked softly. "Yes," she said without pretense. "I did." Poirot nodded slowly. "But you did not send it the moment you wrote it." "No," she confessed. "I paused. I carried it with me all evening, folded in my handbag. I planned to give it to Dr. Martin. I hoped he could pass it on to you. But I've lost my nerve." Poirot waited, letting her continue on her own terms. It wasn't just suspicion, she explained finally. It was fear. Not of Thomas. He was ambitious, but I did not believe he was violent. I was afraid what the truth would cost Delia. I raised her when her parents died. I've watched her get harmed too many times. I worried that if it wasn't him, the accusations would ruin everything. And when you saw him return the next day under pretense of a scarf, I knew, she replied simply. That was the moment I knew for certain. I sent the note that afternoon. Poirot tilted his head. It helped. More than you know. She smiled. Little. And fragile. Funny. I previously performed Lady Macbeth in Brighton. Of course, it's only the neighbourhood theatre. But I recall the saying, "What's done cannot be undone." It echoed in my ears all night. Poirot softly placed his hand on hers. "What has been done cannot be undone, madame. But what is understood might still lead to peace." She said nothing. And he rose, knowing she didn't need a farewell, just stillness. He entered the hall where Graves was dusting the banister with meticulous care. Poirot halted. "You have served this house a long time, I think." Graves made a modest nod. 18 years, sir. Poirot considered him. "You've seen them all, Reuben, Delia, Thomas. You knew them in ways that no guest could." "That may be correct, sir. But in service one learns not to talk unless asked. I'm asking now." Graves paused, the material in his grasp stilled. "Sir Reuben caused storms. He liked it, made him feel alive. Everyone eventually gets tired of hearing thunder, even those who have previously danced in the rain." Poirot gave a single grave nod. "Merci, Graves." He stepped outside into the crisp, clean morning air, the mist being burned away by the modest sun. The square appeared unchanged, but he sensed that something had settled within number 7. Perhaps not healed, but remained still. As he proceeded, a familiar step joined his. Dr. Martin emerged from the far end of the square, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fatigued. "I thought I'd find you still here," he continued. "You never leave a crime scene. Too quickly." "It is not the scene I stay for," Poirot responded. "It is the echo." They walked side by side down the curved route. "She's taking it badly," Martin said. "Delia. She has lost 2 things at once," Poirot explained. "A man she trusted, and the illusion that love is safe." Martin exhaled. "Will she recover?" "She is young," Poirot answered. "But more importantly, she is no longer in someone else's script." Martin offered a tiny laugh. "You always speak as if life were a play." Poirot smiled. "But of course, the metaphor applies to entrances and exits, as well as unheard monologues. But unlike theatre, monsieur, life has no rehearsal." They reached the corner. Poirot halted. "I must leave," he said. "There's a train to catch. And if one waits long enough, the world is always full with new atrocities." Martin reached out a hand. "Thank you, Poirot, for seeing the people behind the evidence rather than the evidence itself." Poirot bowed. "The pleasure was mine, and keep in mind that the truth always has the last word." He turned and walked down the walkway, his silhouette receding into the golden light of dawn, the faint tap of his shoes fading against the pavement. In the distance, a cab approached. He raised his hand, went inside, and disappeared. Morley Square, which had been left behind, returned to its usual quiet. But beneath its serene facades one could hear the gentle murmur of memorized lines. The play was completed. However, those who had witnessed would never forget the parts they performed. 2 weeks later, a light, relentless rain fell across the city, distorting the view from Whitehaven Mansion's windows. Poirot sat at his breakfast table with his customary precision, a properly cut boiled egg, toasty beneath a silver dome, and an Assam teapot steeped exactly to the minute. The Morning Post was neatly placed to his left, unopened. His eyes, however, were fixated on a single envelope in his fingers, cream-coloured, unadorned, but carrying the unmistakable watermark of Morley Square. He opened it slowly. Inside was a folded note written in a precise script. "Hello, Monsieur Poirot, I hope you're well. I am writing not to bother you further with our household concerns, but to express my gratitude for the way you handled the reality and the hurt it left behind. Delia is still calm, However, she now awakens in the mornings without waiting to be summoned. She occasionally wanders alone in the garden, not looking behind her. That's progress. Thomas has not written to her. Maybe he knows better, or perhaps he is ashamed. Regardless, she is no longer waiting for him. I believe she is beginning to perceive her life as apart from the individuals who sought to shape it. As for me, the house's silence seems foreign, but not welcomed. The study has been cleared, and the port decanter is now permanently stored. I keep the windows open more frequently now. The sound of rain has a comforting quality. I hope you recognize that what you did, what you constantly do, is not only to solve difficulties. You recover the threads that others thought they had lost. Henrietta Aldmere expresses sincere thanks. Poirot kept the letter for a bit longer before folding it and returning it to the envelope. He gently placed it on the table beside his plate, as if it could still speak if given the proper care. There was no need to respond. The letter did not ask for one. It had accomplished something rare. It had provided closure. He finished his toast with calm efficiency, then leaned back in his chair and let his mind wander, not aimlessly, but with the same attention he paid to his investigations. He remembered Reuben Drake, the man who thought he could orchestrate emotion as easily as business, who confused control with love and manipulation with presence. He lived a noisy life and surrounded himself with people not because he trusted them, but because he believed no one would dare to betray him within arm's reach. Despite this, treachery did not result in a fight or a shouting match. It had come from nearby. Someone who knew him so well that they could lay a poisoned glass right where he'd reach for it without hesitation. The murder had been carried out with precision rather than emotion. Poirot discovered the deepest despair of all. He stood and strolled to the window, watching the city fade in and out of focus through the soft mist of rain. There was something about the English weather that lent itself to contemplation, an emphasis on nuance, patience. It allowed secrets to breathe before they vanished. The newspaper sat folded on a little table near the window. Poirot snatched it and flicked through the pages on politics, society, rising markets, and falling ministers. A short column was found near the rear, nestled discreetly between adverts and charity announcements. Sentencing for Sir Reuben Drake. Thomas Vale pleaded guilty to manslaughter. His confession, provided in complete cooperation, described emotional collapse and despair. The court accepted the plea, noting remorse, psychological circumstances, and a lack of prior offences. He had been sentenced to 7 years. Poirot read the last line carefully. At sentencing, the defendant made no objections and only spoke once, to apologize to Miss Delia Greer, who did not present. Poirot folded the paper and placed it back on the table. He made no sound, but his brows furrowed slightly as he approached the hearth. The room was dark but comfortable, filled with the peaceful hum of the morning and the subtle ticking of the bronze clock on the mantel. Hastings would have wondered if justice had been served. He would have questioned Poirot about fairness, morality, and whether he ever wished the outcome had been different. But Poirot no longer thought in terms of such binary. The human heart wasn't a courtroom, and conscience wasn't always satisfied with the law. He had sought and found truth. The truth, no matter how painful, was always a sort of mercy. He moved to his writing desk and took out a little notebook. Among his jottings and personal aphorisms, he included this phrase in his script: "In the theatre of murder, the most dangerous actor is the one who forgets they are being watched." Then he closed the notebook and reached for the gloves. Outside, the world waited, not in anticipation, but as it usually did. There would be another case, another silent room filled with too many voices, another glass put exactly where it should not be. Poirot would be prepared, as always, but now, for a few moments, he would stroll through the rain, his thoughts focused solely on the symmetry of leaves falling upon stone. Far behind him, in a towering, red-doored house on Morley Square, a woman sat at her piano playing a tune she hadn't played in 20 years. Not for others, for herself, only once, just enough. The music was simple, but it was hers, and in that, Poirot believed, justice had done everything it could. 3 months later, beneath a clear blue sky that seemed to forgive winter's sins, Hercule Poirot returned to Morley Square, this time as a guest, not as a detective summoned. The event was small, held in Henrietta Aldmere's garden, where spring had begun to soften the frost of the previous months. Daffodils pushed through soft dirt near the garden stairs, and a trellis of climbing roses began to coax buds from the lattice, though they would not flower for some weeks. Nonetheless, the promise was visible. Henrietta personally welcomed Poirot at the gate. She had aged in that little period of time, not in the creases on her face, but in the weight she no longer carried. Her eyes were brighter, and the actress's professional grace had given way to a calmer genuineness. Delia stood behind her, dressed simply, with her hair pulled back to highlight the power of her jaw rather than soften it. "We didn't expect you to come," Henrietta remarked. "Mais non," Poirot responded. "You've invited me. I am Belgian. We do not disregard invitations, especially from women with such formidable hospitality." Henrietta gave a little grin and moved aside. "Tea? But of course." Poirot, Henrietta and Delia sat in the garden, gathered around a tiny iron table originally owned by Henrietta's grandmother. It had seen better chats. Today's wasn't light-hearted, but it was honest. Poirot knew it was enough. Delia talked sparingly, but when she did, it was with new tenacity. She had begun working at a literary charity near Covent Garden, she claimed, helping impoverished students prepare for university. She had no plans to marry soon. She preferred her own flat. She'd taken her mother's maiden name. She didn't mention Thomas. Poirot didn't press. Henrietta ultimately excused herself to care for the lilies. Poirot sipped his tea in quiet, while, alone with Delia, then softly turned to face her. "I'm glad you wrote to me, mademoiselle." She peered up from the edge of her cup. "I wasn't sure if I should. It gave me peace, too," he remarked. "Often the case is closed, but the question remains. What happened of the hearts that remained standing? You've answered it. I'm still looking for the answer," she replied. "But at least I know it's mine to find." Poirot nodded his head in great appreciation. "Bon, that's all that matters." There was a pause. The air moved the petals of a flower that hadn't yet blossomed. "May I ask something?" she inquired. "But of course. Did you know from the beginning?" "About Thomas, I mean." Poirot considered it. "I knew from the first moment that Sir Reuben's death was not random," he told me. "It was too lovely, too much choreography. A guy dies in his favorite chair, at the hour he always drinks, of a substance he would never taste bitterly. There's no struggle. There is no sign of panic, only one perfect scene." She nodded slowly, but knowing who. Poirot continued. "Well, that was different. It was not the facts that revealed him, but the reactions, the silences that were overly careful. The lies are told by posture rather than words." Delia gazed down at her hands. "He loved being watched." "Reuben?" "No." "Thomas? He was always looking for attention." Poirot regarded her for a moment more before saying gently, "And now?" She looked up with clear eyes. "Now I see myself." Poirot thought it was the finest possible solution. He rose, took her hand gently, and bowed over it. "Then you have accomplished what many people never do, mademoiselle. You have emerged from the shadow of the performance," Henrietta rejoined them, dusting soil off her gloves. "You're leaving?" "I am always leaving," Poirot remarked, with a little smile. "That's the nature of a detective, to leave as quietly as you arrived." She nodded. "Still, you are welcome here, should you ever require a garden or silence." Poirot's moustache twitched in enjoyment. "I'll remember that. But I must warn you, I am not silent. I only appear to be so." They said their goodbyes, and Poirot returned through the garden gate to Morley Square. The houses looked the same, red doors, immaculate hedges, polished windows, but there was something different about the air. Less tension, less pretension. As if the house had exhaled. He went slowly to the corner where his cab was waiting, casting a glance over his shoulder at the house that had formerly hosted lying, betrayal, and meticulously curated cruelty. It now held two ladies, neither flawless, but both free. Poirot closed his eyes in the back seat of the taxi. The case had concluded as all cases must, not with triumph, but with truth. Not just with discipline, but also with understanding. Poirot's concept of justice had never included vengeance, it was an order. A slightly off-balanced planet is restored to its equilibrium. so he let the cab take him away, through streets still. Drying from the morning rain, into the heart of a city that would eventually forget the name Reuben Drake, but perhaps remember the calm strength of those he had left behind. The Morley Square affair had come to an end, and, as always, Hercule Poirot had already moved his attention to the next question, which lay just beneath the surface of the next exquisite lie.